No, absolutely. I kind of want to now talk about religious experience and the role that that plays, because I think we're on quite a nice kind of track here. So, very often I kind of go onto Twitter or X as it's now known, and I'll kind of look at the sort of philosophy of religion space, and there'll be atheists and Christians talking about an atheist might say what is required for me to believe in X proposition is for an experience of that X proposition to be true and me to know that it's that. Whereas a Christian or a Muslim or whatever will talk about the experiences they've had as kind of the grounding element in the belief that they now hold in a God. So the sort of question really is, what significance do religious experiences hold in philosophical discussions regarding the existence of God or the nature of the divine? And how do philosophers analyze and interpret these experiences?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of question of like how religious experience in fact leads people to belief or disbelief. And then there's a question of like the evidential significance of religious experience. So there are these sorts of two kind of questions. One is a descriptive matter of like just how religious experiences in fact lead people to believe or disbelieve or whatever. And that I guess that's a question for the psychologists and perhaps, philosophers to provide conceptual tools and so on. But it's a discussion mostly for the psychologists. I guess what I can talk about here is kind of the evidential value or evidential significance of religious experience. So, oh, there's so much here. This is just like a huge portion of philosophy of religion. But I can just give some interesting things that people can think about to kind of spark their inquiry. I guess that's how we'll go about answering this. So, one general point to make here with respect to religious experience, and really just any experience in general, I think a plausible methodological principle in philosophy is that if something seems to be the case, and you don't have defeaters for thinking that it's the case, that is, you don't have grounds for doubting that seeming, you don't have grounds for thinking that it's not the case, well, then you're at least justified to at least some extent in believing that it is the case. So, like, it seems to me that I have hands. I don't have particularly good grounds for doubting that I have hands. And so I'm justified, at least to a certain extent, in believing that I have hands. So I think that seemings and experiences plausibly provide what philosophers call defeasible justification. It's justification of believing something which could be defeated by other considerations, but provided that there are no such considerations, then you're justified in believing it. Again, at least to a certain extent, but I'm going to leave off that little proviso. So I think that's actually a good methodological principle, and if you don't accept it, it's actually going to be a little bit hard to avoid skepticism. Like if you can't trust seemings, for instance, your perceptual seemings, in the absence of defeaters, then it's going to be very hard to defeat the radical skeptic who thinks that you're a brain in a vat, or who thinks that everything is just hallucination, or who thinks that an evil demon is just programming all of our experiences and so on. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to defeat them. It's also going to be hard to justify various kind of foundational logical beliefs, various mathematical beliefs. Like, I don't really have much of a reason to think that 1 plus 1 equals 2, other than that just seems right. It just seems obvious to me. So it's going to be hard to justify mathematics, logic, and indeed just like avoid skepticism if we don't have that methodological principle. Okay, so once we have that methodological principle in play, we can see that if someone really does have a religious experience, wherein it perceptually seems to them that God exists, or that Jesus rose from the dead, or that Jesus is appearing to them, or that Vishnu is appearing to them, or whatever, then I say, in the absence of defeaters, they are justified, at least to a certain extent, in indeed believing in God, or believing that Vishnu exists, or whatever. So I think that's just like plausible methodological principle, straightforwardly gives us that. Okay. Here's an interesting question. Are there defeaters? Right? That's the next question. Are there defeaters? And there may very well be, right? I'm not claiming that these are defeaters, but these are things that people need to take into account, right? So first, there is massive disagreement, right? Like religious diversity seems to pose a defeater, you might think, for the kind of veridicality of religious experiences in the same way that like wildly conflicting eyewitness reports undermine each other, right? Like if two eyewitness reports disagree on like the most basic facts about what happened on a certain crime scene, say, well then it seems like neither of them gives you good grounds for like beliefs about what happened. Like the very fact that both of them disagree and you don't have a specific reason for trusting one as opposed to the other, that seems to cast significant doubt on trusting one of them at the expense of the other. So And, this does indeed seem to be the case, one might think, in the contents of religious experience, right? The religious experience reports are radically different from one another. Some subjects of religious experience, they report experience of, like, nothingness as the ultimate reality. Some, a vast impersonal consciousness in which we all participate, right? Some, this infinitely perfect personal creator. Sometimes the experiences sometimes people experience fundamental reality as if it has like a Trinitarian structure. Some have an experience as a fundamental reality where it doesn't have that kind of structure. So anyway, one might think that massive religious disagreement poses a defeater for the kind of seemings in question. So that's one consideration here. Another consideration one might bear is like, arguably there's lots of arguments just directly for naturalism and atheism, and if one thinks that those arguments are cogent, then arguably they can provide defeaters for the religious experiences in question. And yeah, there's also a few other points that I want to make. The next point that I want to make is that you might think that people can have irreligious experiences. There's actually interesting literature about, like, some people, when they read about, like, accounts of the Holocaust or accounts of particularly horrific evil, they just have this poignant sense, almost like a quasi-religious experience, wherein they can see that, like, no perfect being would allow this sort of thing. Like, this is just so utterly horrific that no one with the power to prevent this could justifiably prevent it. You might think that people have those kinds of experiences. Now, again, it's debatable whether or not people have those kinds of experiences, but, I mean, at least some people have reported having them. So, like, there's also the fact that there seems to be irreligious experience. So if people want to justify God's existence, basically if people want to appeal to religious experience to justify God's existence or some religious claim, they also have to take into account at least potentially widespread irreligious experience of the sort that I just mentioned. And then finally, the last point that I want to make, in addition to disagreement, there being also evidence and arguments for atheism or naturalism that might defeat these, and in addition to irreligious experience, I also want to mention, fourthly, that we shouldn't be understating the evidence. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, suppose we are jurors and a lawyer. We're jurors to this criminal case, and it's a stabbing, okay? And the lawyer says, aha! Smith always carries around a knife with him, and that gives us some reason to think that Smith was the murderer. After all, this person was stabbed. And I guess if someone always carries around a knife with them, then I guess it's a little bit more likely that they'd stab someone than if someone doesn't even have a knife with them at all, right? So, but suppose we learned that the knife is a butter knife. You can't really, and like the butter knife definitely would have been able to make these wounds on someone that the person had. Well then, that's a pretty big defeater for this consideration, right? Like that consideration no longer provides good support for the claim that Smith is the murderer, because it was a butter knife after all. And the lawyer who said that oh, he always carries around a knife, they were committing what's this fallacy called understating the evidence. They were understating what we actually know about the evidence, namely that it was not just a knife, but a butter knife, and that affects the direction of evidential support, right? If it's a knife, if it's just like a knife and you don't specify that it's a butter knife, well then yeah, that might lead you to think that, and justifiably so, might lead you to think that Smith is the murderer, or at least it's some evidence for that. But if it's a butter knife, that's not the case. So, where am I going with this? Well, religious experience, we can't just talk about, oh, people have experiences of God, or something like that, right? We also know lots of other more specific facts about religious experience that seem to be pretty surprising if God exists. Like that it very often leads people to do horrific things, right? I mean, just like look at the Old Testament firstly, but even setting that aside, like people claim to have religious experiences and they end up like drowning their children as a result of it and so on, or they do these terrible things. So that's one thing. Another thing is that the vastly divergent character of religious experiences that I mentioned leads to significant tribalism and warring factions and even religious wars and so on, and you might think that seems kind of surprising if God exists. Like, wouldn't we think that God would kind of want to inform people about his actual character in a kind of reliable way so that they can get to know him as he truly is and have a proper relationship with him? You might think that that's kind of what we would expect. So, like, there are these various more specific facts about religious experience that may very well tell against God's existence, even if the bare fact that people have religious experiences tells in favor of God's existence, right? Because, again, if someone has an experience as of P, that arguably provides some evidence, at least for them, in thinking that P is the case. So there is going to be some kind of support there. But again, we can't ignore these more specific facts about religious experience. So anyway, those are just 4 different points. I hope they were helpful. Just to recap the four points. One of them is, well, it was kind of 5 points. The first one was setting up the first 4, and it was basically saying that given this methodological principle, which is arguably good philosophical practice, religious experiences plausibly provide the person who, minimally, the person who experiences them with justification for thinking that the content of their religious experience is true, is veridical. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that that's in the absence of defeaters, right? And then I just went through kind of 4 different points there. One is that, hey, significant disagreement about the content of religious experiences may very well pose a defeater here. Another potential defeater is like the evidential case for naturalism or atheism. Thirdly, there is irreligious experience that people have to contend with. And then fourthly, we cannot understate the evidence because there's lots of other specific facts about religious experience that may very well seem kind of pretty surprising if God exists. So anyway.
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.